Hello everyone, and welcome to this exam question guide for GCSE History, looking at the 12-mark question for conflict and tension. So this is quite a big chunk of your overall GCSE, being 12 marks in total. So just follow these instructions step by step. I feel like we have done quite well with this question in the past, so it's just a quick brush up to try and secure all 12 of those marks. So the question that we're going to be looking at today is: study sources B and C in the sources booklet. How useful are sources B and C to a historian studying anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your contextual knowledge. Very important that you understand what the topic is that you're being asked, so making sure that you've got a strong grounding in your contextual knowledge, but also that you're able to analyze sources well in order to see what are the sources trying to say and what light do the sources shed on this idea of anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States. So with this question, you'll have roughly 15 minutes in the exam in order to complete it, and it is very important that you do stick to exam timings as much as possible in order to avoid running out of time and making sure that you attempt every single question. So one of the things you need to consider, firstly, is what is the thing the question is asking you about. So when you're reading the sources, you need to have the question in mind. Sources are only useful to a historian if they have a question in mind, if there is something that they are trying to investigate. So you need to work out what is the historian trying to investigate and what do the sources say about that investigation. So we know that our sources are looking at anti-Vietnam War protests. So what does each source tell us about anti-Vietnam War protests? You also need to think about, when you're reading those sources, what can you infer from the source? It might not outright say what the source thinks. You might have to actually read what you can see in the source, what you can see in the text of the source, and then try and work out, what does that tell us? What can I work out from what is in front of me about anti-Vietnam War protests? And then what do those inferences reveal about that? So are they showing protesters supporting the war, so saying that they want to continue fighting in Vietnam, or are they showing protesters against the war? Are they showing protesters attacking the president? Are they showing protesters attacking soldiers and things like that? So what can we see from the sources about anti-Vietnam War protests? The question as well is asking about the sources together. So how could we use these sources together to investigate anti-Vietnam War protests? So what do both sources reveal collectively? That's where those top marks are, by saying what can we do, how do these sources complement each other? They might disagree with each other, but ultimately that would be a good thing for a historian, because if you have two opposing opinions, it means you're getting a bigger breadth of view of things going on at that time and a better understanding of the inquiry point of the question. The other thing is, what specific contextual knowledge or factual detail do you know that you can use to affirm or challenge the claims made in the sources? So if a source is saying something that is anti-war, is there any substance in what they're saying? And if there's not, and if it's saying things which aren't true, it's useful to look at the provenance to understand why they are saying things that aren't true. So for example, if you had a source with Nixon claiming that the Vietnam War was leading to more, or as Johnson said even, the fact that they are killing more than American soldiers are dying, that's useful. We know it's not true, but it's actually useful because we can see that the president is trying to protect himself from being criticised in the public. So another thing as well, so I was talked about provenance, but when you're getting your source, you need to annotate not just the content of the source, but also the provenance of the source. You need to consider nature, origin, and purpose. And what does the person speaking, or the type of source that it is, reveal about the question that is being investigated? So if it's the president, he's obviously going to be standing up and justifying America's involvement in the war. If it's maybe a student, they're likely to be more negative about the war, or civil rights activists as well, especially since Martin Luther King came out in opposition to the Vietnam War. So a really important thing to consider is sources are not facts, they are perspective. And what historians do with those sources is they pull out evidence from those sources to answer the question that the historian has in mind. So we're not necessarily looking for facts, but we're looking to understand what people thought at the time and their perspective on something at the time. So the two sources that we're looking at in order to answer how essentially the anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States are these two sources here. So you have a copy of these, which I've attached for you, but it's a photograph of the Kent State University shootings, and also it is an eyewitness account. So when we're looking at this, then we know the question we have in mind. The historian is trying to find out more about anti-Vietnam War protests, and are these sources useful in achieving that? So source C then we're going to start with, and it is an eyewitness account by Professor Charles Brill, a member of the Kent State University staff in May 1970. So already the fact that this is from the time, May 1970, we know that this is going to be quite useful because it's an eyewitness, somebody who was there and saw the event, and also somebody who was talking about this at the time. But also, I think that something that's quite useful here is we can see he's a member of Kent State University staff. So this is good because it challenges Nixon's rhetoric of student hippie protesters. So in order to undermine the legitimacy of anti-war activists, Nixon tried to argue that all people were hippies and they were just going against the status quo and that there was no validity in their questioning of the government. But here, the fact that this is from a university staff, in fact a professor, challenges that rhetoric that anybody protesting against the war was just a hippie. You also have really quite interesting language used as well. It's very emotive language. And just the last words there, the fact that it's a boy who has been killed and that his blood is soaking his textbooks, and that really emphasizes the innocence of the protesters. And I think if we're going to think about what this is going to do to anti-Vietnam sentiment in America, this is going to exacerbate it. The fact that, as we know from our contextual knowledge, he's one of the four people who was murdered by the state guard at that time. So this is going to really skyrocket anti-Vietnam War sentiment and feelings in America. The other source is source B. So you can see, so it's the provenance at the top, which is a really nice meaty provenance. So use that. The examiner is giving you this as a favour. So read every single word. It's giving you clues about things that you can talk about. So make sure that you do read that carefully. And the content isn't words for this. It is an image. It's the image of a boy who has been murdered and one of his friends crying and screaming over his dead body. And I think it just really conveys the shock and the horror, and the fact that you can see there in the provenance that the journalist took this photo and published this photo because they were scared of a cover-up says all you really need to know about the feeling of anti-government sentiment in America at that time. So just ensure that you take your time to annotate those sources carefully. You look at what the sources are saying and what they both reveal about anti-Vietnam War protests. So what we're going to do now then is we're going to run through an answer. I'm going to essentially show you how you could answer one of these paragraphs. Then you're going to write your own paragraph and upload it, and then I'm going to give you feedback, and we're going to see how we do and how we can improve on this question. So if we're thinking about the way that this needs to be structured, we need to make sure that we've got our argument, we've got our evidence, we've got our explanation, and we've got our judgment. So for our argument, I'll just started it off here. So source B is useful for a historian studying anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States because... So immediately here, this is the stem. You can see quite clearly I've used the words of the question in my answer. That's really important because one, it keeps me focused on the answer and what it is that I'm actually saying, and too often we go and deviate from the question, and when we deviate from the question we lose the strength of our argument. So having that there right at the start is really powerful for keeping us focused. So it's useful because, so what is it that makes it useful? So my argument is it shows how the government responded to the protests. So very clear there, the argument that I'm putting forward, and now I'm going to prove this. This is useful because it shows how the government responded. So I need to say How I know that? Where can I see that? And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make my inference. I'm going to say what I can see in the in the image. So the source shows a man who is lying on the floor, injured and wounded. The girl kneeling next to him is distraught and in anguish. So you can see I'm making very clear references to the source there. Then I need to do my explanation. So when I'm doing my explanation, it's really important that you're not just explaining, but you're also explaining with contextual knowledge. So you're explaining how the detail in the source that you've highlighted proves your argument. And it's not just about analysing the source, it's about explaining how your contextual knowledge supports what you're seeing in the source. So you can see here, this is useful because it shows the government's violent response to protest, which led to the murder of 4 students on the Kent State campus. I've put that in bold there so you can see clearly when I'm using specific factual detail, when I'm using SPED. It's not just about contextual knowledge, knowing that students were murdered, but saying 4 students shows that I actually know what I'm talking about. I know the history in detail and I know it well. It shows the government were willing to turn on its own citizens, exercising their democratic right to protest. This was because Nixon was desperate to maintain his image as the president who would bring about peace with honour, effectively bringing America out of the unpopular war with Vietnam. Under Nixon's regime, anti-war protests intensified, such as the largest protest in US history at the time, involving 500,000 anti-war protesters in November 1969. And you can see all that bit in bold is specific detail. I'm mentioning statistics, I'm mentioning people, I'm mentioning events, and I even have dates there as well. So it's really specific, detailed contextual knowledge. So I've done a good job there, even if I say so myself, of analysing the content of the source. But the other thing I need to talk about in order to show usefulness to a historian is talking about the provenance too. So what does the provenance tell us? The provenance of the source is also useful for a historian studying anti-Vietnam protests in the United States because it shows us that the journalists felt that they could not trust the government. So do you see I'm effectively just using the detail that the examiner gave us in that provenance? This is useful as it reveals that Vietnam had created a credibility gap between the US government and its people, to the extent that they felt that they would cover up the murder of its own citizens. This distrust grew as Nixon's false promises of Vietnamization proved to be untrue, and his decision to bomb Laos and Cambodia in 1969, a matter of months after he was sworn in as president on a promise to end the war. So I'm effectively shedding light on the fact that it's not just this journalist who feels that he can't trust the government. It's a reflection of a wider distrust and that widening credibility gap that we saw with Johnson, and Nixon just further let that gulf grow. So what I need is a judgment about how useful this source. So therefore, source B is very useful to a historian studying the anti-Vietnam War protests, as it reveals that Nixon was so desperate to maintain the illusion that he had control that he was willing to call in the National Guard to achieve it. So you can see that I'm essentially just wrapping up what I'm saying there. I'm tying it all together again, making sure that I'm staying on that question and focused on what is being asked. So over to you. What you're going to do is on Google Classroom, you're going to do source C. And you're going to say why source C is useful. So just thinking about what the source is saying, what I spoke about earlier in the video. And then once you've done that, I want you to add to this judgment. So this judgment is both sources are useful together because they show that the protest turned into a violent and deadly affair. They both give us a sense of how students were standing up for their beliefs and were treated terribly by their government. You could edit this, if you want to push yourself, to just talk about how they complement each other as well. So we had source C, which is talking about the boy who had been killed, and then we can see that that correlates quite directly with what we saw in source C as well. So kind of talking about the relationship between the sources too, in order to get kind of top marks there. So just once you complete that, please submit it onto Google Classroom and I'll give you feedback. Thank you.